Hi, I'm so glad you're listening today. This is the fourth artist in our cultural evolutionary series. Before we get to the episode, I want to recommend a show that's been helpful to me. It's called What the Finance, hosted by Cheyenne and Rachel. This show is full of laid back, really helpful conversations about personal finances and how they actually work in our current capitalist system. Cheyenne and Rachel take on some of the myths about personal finances in our society. I enjoyed their quiet quitting episode personally. I'll include their trailer at the end of the show, and look for them wherever you listen to podcasts. Do you want to change the world? So do I. On this show, we meet artists whose work is doing just that. Welcome to Art Heals All Wounds. I'm your host, Pam Uzel. Can you tell your story in 300 words or less? Recently, I had to do that. I kept doing a count of the words and I was constantly over. So I would reread over and over, taking out everything that didn't stay on point. By the end, my story was focused and simplified around one central theme. And I thought, wow, that left a lot out. Some really juicy parts, in fact. Believe me, though, I understand these kinds of boundaries. As a teacher, I impose them all the time. Your film has to be 3 to 5 minutes long only. You're getting off topic here. Stay focused on the story you're telling. Now, imagine writing your story with no limits and then rewriting it. A year later, let's say. Those stories would change, wouldn't they? There are so many possibilities that could happen in a year to change who we are, because life is complex. And we are complex. If we welcome all of our own complexity into our story, how might that change how we are in the world? My guest today is the fourth artist in the Cultural Evolutionary series. Their name is Jason Wyman, and they're behind the creative hub called Queerly Complex. When I use this word hub, I like to think of the definition of hub in terms of a wheel. The wheel hub is responsible for connecting a wheel to the vehicle, and I feel like this, in many ways, is a great way to visualize what Jason, through Queerly Complex, does. You might imagine that the vehicle is a world in which we stop inflicting so much trauma and violence on each other. I feel that Jason has a vision for this vehicle that isn't about tolerance, but about deep, deep acceptance of complexity. But how do we go about attaching our wheel to this vehicle? That is the work Jason does through Queerly Complex. Helping artists embrace the complexity of who they are is their invitation to share in the co-creation of this world where queerdos can fully be themselves. Jason Wyman and their husband John O'Reilly started Queerly Complex together. What initially began as a blog in 2007 was launched as a website in September 2021. John, who has experience in retail, saw the potential in Jason's visual work as designs for clothing and bags. He also had seen firsthand how Jason was able to work with other artists of many different ages and identities to be able to help them to express themselves. Queerly Complex has become a hub for artists and communities. To quote Jason from the Queerly Complex website, "I use design, illustration, poetry, performance, and media making as inspiration to create services, merchandise, and experiences that help queerdos and their comrades affirm, celebrate, and honor our fabulously unique beliefs, bodies, and beings. Hi, Jason. Welcome to Art Heals All Wounds. Can you start by telling us who you are and what you do?
Hi, my name again is Jason. I live in San Francisco, which is also known as Yelamu, unceded Ramaytush Ohlone land. What I do is I am an artist and also a creative coach. And what that means for me is that I make work that helps me make sense of the world and the cosmos. I was just at a party last night and I was asked this question, what is art? And, for me, art is never about the end product as much as, artists have products and those products become for sale or become a record or something. Art really to me is the process of understanding and making meaning of this thing called life. And that is the most beautiful thing. And it is something that I'm incredibly passionate about and something I help other artists better articulate for themselves. Because so often artists are forced to use the language that is accepted by institutions, whether that be galleries, whether that be the stage, whether that be a theater, whether that be academia or, even just regular public schools. They're forced to use the language of the institution to describe their work. And that creates disconnect often between artists and the way in which they want to make meaning.
Wow, that resonates with me a lot. I don't want to go too in depth with this, but I was once a part of a filmmakers group where our priority was how to make the film we wanted to make. So I hear where you're coming from with that. And, you've created this space and this community called Queerly Complex. And I asked you when I first met you if it's complex or complex. And you never answered me. But and you did exactly what you're doing now. You got this big smile.
Yeah. It's a little bit of both. I think so much of the way we try to make meaning of our world is by simplifying our world or simplifying our thought. Mantras have never actually really worked for me because mantras are in a lot of ways an oversimplification of a complex view of the world. And so for me, a complexity is something that I find fascinating. I find it to be a driving force in my life to want to complexify other things and not make everything so simple. But also, the complex of almost like a compound or a gathering space is the way in which I facilitate that complexity. So for me, a lot of my work is about gathering people, gathering ideas, gathering and holding space for that complexity to emerge from a group. I'm lucky in that I have a lot of people that I get to work with and a lot of spaces where I get to facilitate and create this kind of complex space. And so it's a little bit of both. I don't think it's one or the other. I think it's actually trying to walk that fine line between this idea of almost like a gathering point, which would sound almost less distributive. It would sound like it's trying to be somewhat hierarchical by gathering everything, but in an effort to actually distribute and disperse rather than hold onto or archive.
Interesting. Well, you have a really big and inclusive vision in this, but I would love to back up a little bit and see what brought you to this idea of creating this space and this community.
I have always been a weird outsider. And, I know that's a label a lot of people take. There are a few moments in my life that really, I think, highlight this kind of outsider perspective in some ways. The first was in the sixth grade, I attended a Catholic school, and it was called St. John's. And I got my tailbone broken in a game of Smear the Queer. And it was early on in the year. And I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but when you have your tailbone broken, you actually have to sit on a cushion for 6 months. You can't actually sit on anything hard. So in sixth grade, I had all of this dental surgery. So I had to wear this big retainer that I literally had to take out of my mouth in order to speak, because it was one of those bite-in retainers for top and bottom to correct an overbite. And I had to carry around this brown donut cushion. And that was my entire sixth grade. And, it was really a hard year for myself to go through that in a class of only about 24 students as well. So it was a really tiny, small Catholic school. And, years later, I know we might touch on this in a moment, but years later, I found out that that was the same school and the same grade level in which my dad got violently bullied for being perceived queer. So when that happened to me, it actually created a weird relationship between me and my dad that I never really fully understood. And I didn't actually fully understand it until he died in 2020, actually. So that's like one thing, because it made me an outsider within the school community, but it also made me this like weird outsider in my family, just because it brought up unresolved issues of homophobia in the family. So that's like one moment of kind of being an outsider. A second moment of being an outsider is also related to Catholicism. I went to seminary to be a priest right after high school. Part of it was I really believed in my faith. Part of it was the seminary gave better financial aid, and I didn't know how to go to college without significant financial aid. So I ended up going into seminary, and while I was in seminary, I came out. And as a result of coming out, I was 18, I was a freshman in college, and the seminary itself kicked me out. They were like, you can't actually say that you're queer or gay. You actually have to repress that. And I looked at the priest and I said, well, you do realize all the other seminarians are asking me for favors, but they're not saying that they are. And they were like, well, that's the way that it's done, and you just can't say it. And I was like, okay. And they booted me out. And when that happened, I was devastated, one, but I also didn't know where I was going to live. Like it ended up becoming a real, like, how do I stay in school? How do I find a place to live? Who do I live with as an out queer person in 1994-95 in Minnesota at a Catholic university that I'm still trying to stay at? And so there was a group on campus called Commitment to Diversity, which had been founded the year before I got there, because a cross was burned on the front lawn of African American students that attended the university.
Wow.
And so I didn't know him at the time, but he became a friend of mine named Stacy Danner and Lorena Munoz. Both of them were the head of Commitment to Diversity. And I sat down with them and I was like, I don't know what to do. And Stacy looked at me and was like, well, you're kind of staring at me. You're making me feel uncomfortable. It seems like you're kind of racist. I don't really know that I can help you unless you figure some stuff out. And, this was before just being able to Google something. So, and it was right at winter break. So like we were at winter break. I was supposed to come back in January. I didn't know where I was living. I didn't know what I was doing. So I just went to the Minneapolis Public Library and started up looking at books on racism. And I just started reading stuff, not knowing anything about anything, not knowing if what I was doing was correct or not correct. And I brought that back to Stacy and I said, here's the work I'm doing. And Stacy looked at me and said, all right, it seems to me like you're actually doing the work. And he found me a roommate who was a closeted gay guy. And he got me paired with that person, and I was able to stay on for that spring semester of my freshman year. And then, surprisingly, Stacy and Lorena advocated to the Residence Hall Association and got me an RA position my sophomore year of college as an out queer kid at a Catholic university in 1995.
Wow.
Yeah. Ultimately, the school didn't like me, so the school used everything that they could to get me out of the school and expelled me at the end of my sophomore year. I mean, the school just didn't want me around. I was too much of a rabble-rouser. But for me, my queerness became directly tied to understanding racism and anti-racism. And I know that that's not a typical experience in a coming out story, that you have two straight people of color who literally have your back so much that they get you money and get you a place to live and advocate very strongly on your behalf to an incredibly conservative university. And I was the only out student at the time, like at all. And so there were a bunch of other queer kids, but I was literally the only out student on campus. And I ended up, after getting kicked out of there, going down a much deeper path of anti-racism. And I started working for AmeriCorps, and I actually started training for AmeriCorps across the Midwest on anti-racism and white privilege as, again, an out queer person at the same time. So, for me, those two experiences, both really related to the Catholic Church, really solidified in my own life. How is it that I can move in the margins and use what I can in order to build solidarity and camaraderie among groups of people that don't look like me, might not sound like me, might not be me at all. But that, to me, those two things very explicitly really have shaped my life in wanting to figure this thing out as a white male presenting queer. It is definitely something that I have spent the rest of my life trying to figure out and really working on understanding the dynamics of power in order to find ways to redistribute, flatten, and share in very authentic, very queer ways.
Right. And I hope you don't mind me asking, but I'm still really thinking about this thing that happened to your father so many years ago, and then that it was repeated with you in this Catholic school. And I think you mentioned that your father passed away.
Yeah.
What became of your relationship with your father?
I, ended up not speaking to my parents for 6 years in my 20s. And that was a really pivotal moment for myself and for my family. I know that it really hurt my parents to not speak to them, but I needed to figure out who I was. And there was just no way that I was going to be able to do that while still in the shadow of my family. And I was living in San Francisco at the time, so it was easy. Sadly, it was easy to cut off ties because you just don't pick up the phone and there was no cell phone. So you just didn't answer the landline. That was easy to cut off ties in a lot of ways. And, for myself, I know that was a really difficult time, but I also know for my parents, it was excruciatingly difficult for them. And, in the last year or so of my dad's life, he wanted to relive a lot of things that he did that he felt might have been wrong in a lot of ways. My dad was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's mantle cell lymphoma in the end of 2018, beginning of 2019. He started his cancer treatment. I was the one in the family that really knew it was terminal. I think that there was a lot of wanting to have hope that it wasn't going to be terminal, but I pretty much knew it would be right from the beginning, considering he most likely got it from handling toxic chemicals his entire life. And so the first year of his cancer, he kept asking to relive moments of pain. And I put a kibosh on a lot of that, to be honest, because I was like, I don't know that reliving these moments is necessarily going to heal you or me, in all honesty. Like, I actually think it's just trudging stuff up. Like, while we didn't speak for 6 years, we had 15 years or more of speaking after not speaking for six years. So I had to remind my father that, like, while there was this moment, there is no impetus to this moment. I know that we all wanted to justify or have a real concrete reason as to why we stopped talking, but there wasn't one, actually. It was, I just needed to do something for myself. Like, I don't know how else to describe it. And my dad was like, okay, I guess we don't have to talk about it, and it's okay. And that really shifted, I think, something in my father. And so in 2020, after COVID hit, there was no opportunity for me to go visit my father the last year of his life because of his cancer. With COVID and no vaccine, it meant I would have had to have traveled on an airplane and then lived in a hotel for at least 2 weeks to quarantine, to make sure that I didn't have this thing, to then be able to possibly go see my father. And there was just no financial way that I could live in a hotel for 2 weeks. Like, that just was not possible. So what ended up happening is my dad had noticed that there had been a lot of growth actually in himself. And he asked for something in the final 6 to 7 months of his life, which was to start a letter writing process back and forth between us. That he felt very strongly that others in his community needed to hear directly from him and from me about how we've come to terms with a straight father and a queer child. Mm. And so that is what spurred understanding the bullying of my dad in the 6th grade. Like, I might have heard some of those stories in the past in offhanded ways, but there is a difference when you're hearing it kind of in passing as a throwaway comment to something, and another thing to receive a letter from your father that is talking about the homophobia that he experienced in the 6th grade. Mm. And so, for me, there ended up being nothing left unsaid between me and my dad before he died. I was the one that received a lot of the calls from him when he was really at a very low point and was questioning his faith in very specific ways. By the end of his time, he had surprisingly renounced Catholicism. He still had his faith and he still loved being Catholic, but he realized that there was no distinction between any of the major ways that we actually thought about the world or religious thought in general. We had a conversation actually about him looking directly at death and realizing that there, in some ways, was no point other than, at this point in time, healing the relationships that he could heal. As much as it's painful and as much as I would love to have him here, I think it's only in his facing his own death that transformation was able to occur, and thus we were able to transform each other.
Well, I could see by your face that that was not an easy story to tell, but thank you for sharing it. It really is such a great example of what's possible between people, and that none of us has to be stuck in any one place or in any belief system. So Where did you go from there? That wasn't that long ago. Where did you go from there?
I was also the storyteller of my dad's cancer. So, a lot of my artwork has been in writing in the past or revealing deeply personal things about myself. So this whole letter writing thing was not uncommon, and it was a very lovely thing for my father to suggest. And it was also suggested because I was the one that figured out how to communicate all aspects of my father's cancer every step along the way. Whenever something happened, how do we actually tell that story? So, after my dad's passing, in 2020, I had a pretty giant revelation myself, which was I had a fairly good client at the time that was paying most of my bills. I actually loved the work that I was doing, but I was doing it for a client and for an industry that I just didn't want to be a part of. I love youth media. I have a long history in youth development and youth media making, but I didn't want to do youth media. I got back into it. I was asked to come back into the field at the request of a board member of an organization. And I said yes. And I did it for 5 years. And I thought I loved it. And after watching my dad die, I realized that it didn't matter that I loved it. It isn't what I wanted to do. And it isn't how I wanted to be seen in the world. And I was just like, life's too short for this. And so I didn't get my contract renewed at the end of 2020. And I decided to use that time as an opportunity to figure out what is it that I really want to do. And for me, I work best in partnership with people. Some things might look solo on one level, but there's always someone else, always, not kind of, there's literally lots of people. And so my husband and my husband has been one of my biggest supporters. We've been married 15, 16 years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it'll be 16 this summer. And he has always seen something in me that I don't see. And he has always been the one to encourage me to put myself a little bit more forward. My tendency is to fade to the background or step aside, as a white male presenting person that does most of their work with communities of color. It is a natural thing to want to step behind or step aside. Mm-hmm. And my husband really saw that was actually eating away at my ability to actually make stuff. And so he suggested that I put some of my visual work, which is mostly done in digital media, onto some t-shirts. He works retail, and he was like, well, why don't we take some of your visual works? It's not like it's going to be, they're never going to be real prints. So instead of thinking about your work as art, why don't we think about your work as product? And his background's retail. So he was like, if we think about it as product, then we can actually make retail decisions about your visual work. And so we had been trying to figure this out for a long period of time, and we just decided to jump right into it at the beginning of 2020 and just jump in with both feet and found a business, which is Queerly Complex. Now, that itself was fabulous and fun, but it was a lot of work, and it really took me towards this kind of productization mode and thinking in kind of product development cycles, which is not necessarily the way that I like thinking, and it's not my best thinking. But it got us to the place of launching queerlycomplex.com, really as just an online retail shop. Now, I've never made my money in online retail because online retail is a terrible business model, to be perfectly frank. And I make most of my money doing consulting work and doing large-scale consulting work. And yet I didn't see a connection between the large-scale consulting work or even some of the coaching that I had been doing and my visual product. I had no idea that they were the same thing. I actually thought that they were two separate things. And so my husband and I went into business just to kind of launch this more visual side of my work through simple retail products. But in spring, winter, spring, early winter, or late winter, early spring of 2022, I got accepted into the Optima Business Co-op, Optima Entrepreneurship Co-op program out of Oakland. And I had an incredibly fantastic facilitator and a really good cohort that helped me understand that my visual work and my consulting work were actually one and the same. And so after, burying my dad and getting a little bit of distance from this one endeavor, that I had another kind of epiphany. And that's where this kind of broader worldview for queerly complex started coming in. And it really started resurrecting. I had a blog after John and I got married. I started a blog called Queerly Complex on Blogger, the old Google platform that is defunct. And it was just a way for me to write about my personal life. And then it died after like 3 years because, you can't sustain a blog like that while also working full time. And for me, re-resurrecting the initial concept of this idea of how we find our place in the world, all of my visual work in a lot of ways is about how we find our place how I have found my place in the world. And that a lot of my consulting and coaching work is helping others find their place in this world. And as a result of that, there's a direct connection between the visual work and the actual consulting work that I do. And that to me really has unlocked for myself a real desire, again, to be able to talk about complexity more. It's not about whittling ourselves down or making something more consumable because people don't like busy. Do you know what I'm saying? Or people want the simple answer. Instead, how can I use complexity in order to generate more complexity? And as a result of that, not have things get reduced. And it's a tough endeavor on a website where people only want to spend, 60 seconds and don't want to click through things. Right. But I feel very confident in this new business that I have with John in being able to do this, because the results for me at least speak for themselves in that I've been able to really help a lot of artists and a lot of creatives and a lot of entrepreneurs take a look and question their values and what their values are and how to use their values for decision making. And that, I think, only can come from someone that has done this and keeps doing it and keeps questioning the assumptions about what they see in the world and how they move in the world. And, ultimately, I have to say, I owe a debt to my father for showing me very explicitly and very directly what radical transformation actually is through looking at death. And, for me, that has meant also looking at death and not turning away. Whether that be my father's death, whether that be the death of my husband's best friend this summer and having to step into a role of alchemist, a family of choice and holder of the family during a time of grief. Or whether that be, I had this art project that I did where I learned that we had dropped over 11,000 bombs in Afghanistan during the Afghan war. And I started this process of drawing 11,000 bomb icons to just try to comprehend how much our country has dropped somewhere else. Like it's an unfathomable number. Do you know, right. 11,000 is too many for us to really comprehend. Right. And I never actually finished that because I couldn't draw 11,000 bombs. But I have tended not to shy away from looking at a lot of things that people don't like looking at. And I will say, not getting stuck there. I think that there's a difference in being able to look and then find yourself in a loop or stuck in a place. And at the same time, there is something to be said about being able to look at something like that and allow it to actually change you and not be the same person as a result of having to look at something. And that to me, I started that project, Afghan Bomb Project, a while ago, and it was way before my dad's death and cancer. But my dad's death made me reevaluate even why I do what I do. And I didn't realize that that was partly what I was doing, and why I was able to be there for my dad was because I already had a practice of looking at this stuff and not turning away from it.
Wow, that's an amazing connection to have, and to be able to see what gave you your particular gifts, I would say. And I mean, one thing that I think I hear you saying, and you can tell me if I'm wrong or right, is that there is always possibility of change for the better. And by better, everybody might have a different definition of that, but inclusivity, greater equity. I mean, I could go on, but if we're willing to look at something, be changed, and then move out of it, making different choices. Is that what you're saying?
That is what I'm saying. I think there's a lot of pain in this world. There's a lot of suffering. There's a lot of trauma. There's a lot of harm. And we all have our own paths that we have to take in regards to those things. And for some, not looking at that stuff is a coping mechanism. Not engaging with it is a way to survive, and may not just survive, but actually maybe thriving too, to be honest. For me, I think it's because of my anti-racism work and the understanding of a deep understanding of the ways in which racism is baked into every single structure in this country, from banking to housing to land use to healthcare to education, just like it's everything, to the family unit. Like, it is absolutely everywhere. And you cannot not be affected by it. Like, no one is not affected by racism.
Right.
But we have such a strong desire to not acknowledge that on so many levels, for so many different reasons, among so many different peoples. But if we can't face it, there actually is no way to undo it.
Right.
Because it will just perpetuate itself, because it is actually a system of which we are all a part of and contributing to. So similarly to racism, other things, when we can more directly face them, as you mentioned, we actually have an opportunity to change. And to change how we want to talk about things, to change how we want to relate to other people, to change our belief systems and the myths that are central to our lives. The myth is not, to me, a falsehood. Myth is a belief larger than oneself that helps you move through the world. But those myths don't always serve us. And we need the ability to look at them more, to question them, and to allow ourselves to change our own myths.
Yeah. I'm curious because I'm feeling in myself this real balance between hopefulness that this is possible and also exhaustion, feeling like, well, how does this actually happen? And I wonder if you feel the same thing, or if or if you feel more towards the hopeful side, or what do you, if you do feel those two things, how do you balance it, and how do you kind of keep that cup half full activist cup? Because it's hard.
It is hard. I will also say, I don't know that there is ever such a thing as balance, actually. And years and years and years ago, I was doing work with a Buddhist foundation here in the Bay Area, and this idea of balance was something that was very central to the foundation and to the way that they wanted the world to kind of go in a lot of ways. And it was this idea of kind of equanimity, of even temperedness, that we have to be able to face, when we face the world, that we have to face the world with this kind of, like I said, equanimity or even temperness. I had a hard time with that when it was brought up back then, almost 15 years ago, maybe even a little more. Today, I would reject it straight out. And I reject it because we have to feel. The only way through this is to actually allow our feelings sometimes to consume us. We cannot logically get out of this. Logic will be needed for us to be able to bust our myths and be able to create new ones. Logic will be required for that, because that is a process of unlearning bias. And bias is better unlearned through logic, in all honesty. But we cannot negate the overwhelm. We cannot suppress the massive depression. I have major bouts of massive depression. I used to think there was something wrong with that. And how do I move out of this quickly? I don't care about moving out of that. I care about, can I still be functional, and can I still get the things done that need to get done while in the midst of also feeling depressed? That to me is important, because I want to continue building. I want to continue creating. I want to continue being in community and solidarity with people. And that only happens if I functionally can still show up. Do I have to show up and put my depression at the door? No, I actually don't. And it's better for the group if I don't, to be honest. Because we actually need to learn how to live with it. We actually need to know how to be in community with people who are sad. We are not good at being in community with people who are sad. People who are anxious. We're never good at giving space for those people. So for me, balance is not something I strive for. I strive for being able to understand what I'm actually feeling and experiencing, and being able to let that be while also still finding a way to move and to make a way forward for myself. And sometimes that means that depression is, a couple of weeks. Sometimes that means it's a moment in an afternoon. Sometimes it means it's joyful and I actually am able to look at things and laugh at stuff. And, it's it's the entire range of emotion. It's not one or the other. Sometimes being angry, again, we have this fear of anger in this country, and yet anger is an incredibly useful tool. It can be useful. It often is used in unuseful ways, but that doesn't mean that the rage you feel should be suppressed.
Wow. This has been a really moving conversation, but I don't want to close without giving you an opportunity to share what you're doing and where people can find out about it, because you just gave us a lot in this conversation. But now take a moment to tell us what you're doing, where people can find you, and where they can find Queerly Complex and connect.
Yes. So you can find Queerly Complex online at queerlycomplex.com, queerlycomplex.com. I am also Queerly Complex on all social media, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and even YouTube, because YouTube now allows for personalized URLs. So you can actually find Queerly Complex on YouTube. Some of the things that I am doing right now are, one, I have been working on supporting distributive networks for a variety of different communities, actually. One of those communities is an immigrant artist network, and we are just launching our brand new website today called immigrantartistnetwork.com. Yay.
Wow.
Yeah, it's very exciting. This was co-founded with Rupi C. Tut, who is a painter in Oakland. She's a classical Indian painter. I adore Rupi. I love working with Rupi. In 2019, we started working together to create virtual offerings for immigrant artists, not knowing COVID was coming, and then COVID came, and then we were able to keep it going and actually form it into a real collective and distributive network. And we are about to launch a new round of virtual art salons for immigrant artists and their comrades. I am not an immigrant artist. I am a comrade artist to immigrant artists. So I do want to put a shout out for the comrades out there who know how to support other folks as well. So immigrantartistnetwork.com will have all of that information for that. Another distributive network that I've had the good honor of co-creating with Crystal Mason and Trayvon Smith and Midori and Black Howry and Juan Carlos Escobedo is something called Queer Art School. It will be a flat, peer-based school where our first offering is going to be a queering artist narrative boot camp that we will be doing this summer. Wow. You can find more information about Queer Art School on the Queerly Complex website. And we'll be having a couple of gatherings in April, one gathering at the end of April and another gathering mid-May to talk more about Queer Art School and queering artist narratives as well. And then the last thing that I'll mention is I have been doing a lot of work with Crystal Mason under another banner called Tree of Change, treeofchange.net. And we've been helping a variety of organizations, from foundations to museums to equity and land use organizations, reassess how it is that they cultivate belonging, how they want to cultivate belonging, what they're doing, how their values and dreams and mission either further those things or take them away from those things, and even helping develop peer-based pedagogy and praxis. Mm-hmm. We even have a new project with Independent Arts and Media called Dandelion Arts Finance Training Program, which will have a series of workshops later this year, specifically for Black, Indigenous, immigrant, queer, trans, disabled, poor, and rural folks. So again, you can find all of that at queerlycomplex.com. When I say it is a very complex website, I mean that. It is a portal to a lot of different things. And on an individual tip, for anyone at any point in their career or in their life or in their creative practice, I do offer creative coaching. And creative coaching is a tool and mechanism that I use to help you better articulate and explore your values and dreams so that you can have tools and tactics to help you make decisions in ways that you want to make decisions. I work a lot with folks that have some sort of creative block. And what I've realized in working with a lot of those artists, it normally boils down to, what are my values and how do I make decisions? That the block is not actually anything more than a question of where you are in the world. And so I help people find their way.
I love that. Well, thank you so much, Jason. And it's just been amazing to talk to you today. And I'm really, really grateful that you shared your story and all of your wisdom.
Well, I appreciate being asked to come on, Pam. It is a pleasure to get to know you more. Thank you for the opportunity to tell this story and to be able to share really not just my story, but my dad's story. I don't think either one of us, when we were either in sixth grade, would have ever imagined that this is the life we get to celebrate together.
You're listening to Art Heals All Wounds. Thank you so much to Jason Wyman for joining me today and sharing their story. I particularly appreciate that they shared the story of their relationship with their father. Their story is such a great reminder of what is possible, of how things that seem so incredibly solid and immovable actually are not. So thank you, Jason, for sharing that story. And if you're listening today, thank you for making room for this story in your life. How do you fit in? I hope you find your comrades and that together you can find the support to express who you truly are with whatever complexity that entails. Feel free to reach out to me through my website, arthealsallwoundspodcast.com. And if you know someone who you think would enjoy hearing these stories of artists, please share the show with that friend. The music you've heard in this podcast is by Ketsa and Lobo Loco. This podcast was edited by Eva Hristova. As always, this show was recorded using Squadcast FM. Art Heals All Wounds comes to you from Oakland, California, on unceded territory of the Choqueño Ohlone people.
Do you feel like there's not enough personal in your personal finance world?
Or maybe you know there's absolutely no way you can bootstrap yourself out of a bad system designed to see you fail.
If either one of these applies to you, then you need to listen to What the Finance. What the Finance is independently produced by me, Cheyenne.
And me, Rachel. You can subscribe to What the Finance anywhere feisty podcasts are found.